So I want to go on my theme for tonight, which is a bit of a repetition of the concentration of what we talked about in the so-called all and everything class. And here's one thing that we talked about. And I talked about it as several existential choices a person has to make when one thinks about deep things. And the first one is, this is very familiar to most of you, but I don't think I can teach this enough, because there's always a new person who needs to hear this, and there's always a person who hears it and says, now I get it. And someone hears this and it'll come up in a conversation and you'll realize that this is the time to teach it. When we think about the origins of creation, 3.7 billion years ago of the universe unfolding, there's a lot of discussion of what was before the so-called Big Bang, before the retro-engineered moment of creation. What was before that? Nobody knows. Depending on a person's philosophic orientation, there will be different answers. One say there's just been an eternally exploding and expanding and regressing, expanding and regressing. There's no beginning to this. So the beginning is actually not the beginning. It's just the beginning again. Another person will say, no, it actually was a beginning. We don't have any evidence for a constantly expanding and collapsing universe, so there was a beginning. So what can we possibly know about that which was before the beginning? I'm of this point of view, that it had the intelligence and power to create our universe, the mathematics and physics of our universe, from Newton down to subatomic physics, Einstein and after, and it's the mass, energy, anti-mass, anti-energy for 140 billion galaxies. So whatever there was before that, it had the intelligence to design and emit this universe into being. And now the question is, did a world of value come into being at the same time? So to put it for ourselves, our practical usage, that when we use words such as, and I like to use the word human rights, as it says in the Declaration, that we're all endowed with the rights, among them are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So are we endowed by our Creator with something real, or is just a made-up human phantasm? David Hume, the philosopher, would say, they refer to nothing. Words like right, wrong, human rights, justice, etc., they don't refer to anything. It's just basically a fancy way of expressing personal preferences. So Hume would say, if I say I'm against slavery, what I'm really saying is I don't want to be a slave. I don't really care about other people. Now, I'm adamantly against that. When I was in graduate school, I had a choice to make between Hume and Kant. I chose Kant. So I really, truly believe that the world of value exists and that it pre-existed human beings, and therefore we are born into a world of value. Now, what happens in in certain discussions is another person will say, can you prove it? And the person who believes in the reality of the world of value feels that they have to prove it. And we can just turn that around and say, can you disprove it? Can you prove that the world of value does not exist? Meaning when we say words like just, love, justice, truth, beauty, the good, the holy, is that referring to something or simply a subjective state? Now, that's an existential choice. There's no proof, mathematical, natural science, empirical. There's no scientific proof for either way. Therefore, we have to make what I'll call an existential choice, meaning the choice you make will shape your existence as a human being. Some of you may hear tones of William James and John Dewey, or pragmatism, meaning proposing a reality and see how it works to live in that reality, and then propose a reality where those words do not exist. So a word where we don't say human rights, we don't say civil rights, we don't talk about the depth of love, we don't talk about beauty, we don't talk about truth. It's an unimaginable world. So even though a person might say those words don't refer to something real, they refer to something. They refer to a mode of consciousness that we human beings can't live without. So sometimes when people say those words don't refer to anything, at least they refer to us. At least it refers to the way we think. So when the skeptic says they don't refer to anything, hey, that's not true. It might be self-referential, but it's self-referential in a profound way, meaning these words have a hold on us. Even if the words are self-referential, when I say human rights, when I say love, justice, truth, and beauty, those words make a claim on us. So experientially, those words refer to something beyond us. I'll call it the metaphysical realm, and they make a claim on us. Okay, so that's one thing we talked about in class. Is there a world of value, and how can we know the world of value? And of course, that speaks to something called human consciousness. Again, is there something called consciousness? Is there something called the mind? If you say no, you have a lot of explaining to do. What is thinking? What is reflection? Try to imagine a person adamantly proclaiming there's no such thing as consciousness, there's no such thing as mind, there's just brain. I find that actually a ridiculous thought, but a lot of smart people say it. I just think there's a reason they say it, because they, like everybody else, cannot fully make sense of consciousness and mind. And one reason is we live inside those words. It's not as if we can look at those words objectively and say, this is a microphone, this is a Kiddush cup. We live inside the realm of consciousness and thought, so we can never see it from the outside, but we can detect, you might say, like something like the fish that detects that the fish lives in water. The human being that detects that the human being lives in being, as Heidegger would put it. The fact that I can detect that I live in something called being doesn't mean that I can adequately define it. I mean, Heidegger's book, Time and Being, is a long attempt, overlong attempt to try to describe what it means to discover being and discover one's own being and the beingness in which we exist. I don't recommend reading it. Definitely is worth an article or something. But one question is there a world of value? Which leads us to idea of consciousness. What is consciousness and mind? Now, many people in the class were asking, what is this for? Why do I need to think about these things? And that's the last term that I taught in the class, because from this we can discuss what I'll call the realm of the soul. And from my understanding, the connection between mind and soul. I'll just say a few words about that. One of the many ways that I define soul as the place where we unconsciously and intuitively grasp the reality of the world of value, such as love, justice, truth, and beauty. It's a spiritual and moral intuition. So when people first used the word love, no one sat down and explained what the words mean. Suddenly, children start just using words like love, justice, truth, beauty. And as they become more adept at the language and they hear stories, they learn. This is more of a sense of Steven Pinker, that we're not a blank slate. Wittgenstein, that we learn how to use these words. And if one were to say to a child, well, there's no such thing as fairness, it doesn't exist, quit using that word, I think one would make a child's, number one, would be morally impoverished, and I think would actually do damage to a child. And I've had those discussions when I sit around a group of philosophers and someone says, well, those words don't exist. And I say, well, what do you say when someone steals something from your child? Do you say property is an illusion? Theft is a made-up word? I said, what do you say to your child? And if they want to be honest, they say, no, I actually say that, there's something called property. It is not inherent in the thing. So you can't empirically define property from a natural science or mathematical perspective. You can't define theft from a mathematical scientific perspective. You can't describe the loss one feels when one's possessions are stolen. So look how impoverished, even the person who says, I don't believe these words refer to anything, try to imagine their child's life without those words. And, as I asked this one person, I said, do you use these words as if they are real? The person said, yes. I said, I'm really glad to hear that. I hope you don't teach this to your children. They say, no, this is more for the classroom. I didn't say what I thought next. Well, then you're creating a spiritual impoverishment with your students. this reminded me of many years ago. I still am, but haven't acted on it. Kurt Vonnegut fan. So I love the books of Kurt Vonnegut, and he tells a little story in his book Breakfast of Champions. And if you know, Kurt Vonnegut was something of a professional smart aleck. He was a satirist and irony, especially about Western culture, the human condition, and he just created a lot of humor, skepticism about everything. And he describes a speech he gave where he said a man raised his hand. I think Vonnegut said he was a 5x5 kind of a guy, short guy, stout, who asked in a Eastern European accent. So Vonnegut inferred a lot from that. And he said, "What gives you the right to instill such skepticism in all these young people?" And Vonnegut was left speechless. So Vonnegut was a raconteur of skepticism and nihilism. And some person who clearly came from a place where these weren't idle questions. Is there right? Is there wrong? Is tyranny wrong? Is genocide wrong? Is mass murder wrong? These weren't idle questions of a certain generation. And that generation was still alive, those who survived in 1973, I believe, when Vonnegut wrote the book. That had a jarring effect on me because I loved Vonnegut. And then I read this interchange that Vonnegut reported. If I have it wrong, please tell me. And in Vonnegut sharing that interchange, I don't think Vonnegut loved himself. And then I began looking, what did I love about Vonnegut? And I had never clearly thought to myself, wait, I'm a moral realist. And I really mean it. And I don't think I like it, the idea that people so insistently teach skepticism and nihilism and not understanding the full consequences of teaching those terms. I don't think they refer to reality. And I think at some level with some people, like the person I spoke about last week who committed suicide, leaving the note, the why is the reason, this can be taken too far. So our class last time, we think about the beginning of creation, and I encouraged the class to assume that with creation, the physical creation, comes consciousness. One of the functions of consciousness is to apprehend metaphysical realities. One aspect of consciousness is a mode of consciousness called the soul, where we apprehend those metaphysical realities in a mute part of our being that apprehends them, but then has to deliver them up to the mind for rational analysis. I know that justice exists, but I don't know exactly what it is until I think about it. I know that love exists. So this is where you might say the mind and the soul have to work together, which leads me to the last thing I want to say, the uncomfortable conclusion that there are people who think better and worse ways about metaphysical values. Okay? Not every thought about metaphysical values is equal. People are created equal, but philosophical reflection is not created equal. And that's why I'm offering this class, because I actually think it's critically important that we philosophically reflect on the metaphysical values that give depth and meaning to our lives. I'll say that one more time. I think it's critically important that we reflect on the metaphysical values that give depth and purpose to our lives.